This is 7-4. You're not sure for some reasons? Well, if you assume, yep. Right, did I realize that visually? Of course. I know why. So, if you assume, yep. Right, did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know why. So, if you assume, yep. Right, did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, for some reasons, if you assume visually. Of course. I know why. If you assume visually. I know, so if I assume. Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea why. Well, if you assume. Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. No, right? If I assume visually. Of course. I know, right? So, if you assume. Yep. Right, If I assume visually. Wait, how do you know this? I don't know, but you assume visually. Of course, you have no idea. So, if you assume. Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. I know, right? So, if you assume. Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know. Right? So, if you assume. Yep. Right. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So, if you assume. Yep. Right. Because I said so, definitely. I was gonna know this eventually. Of course, you have no idea. I know why. So, if you assume. Yep. Right. So, you didn't know this? Nope. Right. If I assume, definitely. You have no idea. I know, right? So, if you assume. Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So, if you assume? Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So, if you assume? Yep. Right, Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. If I assume, eventually, of course. I know, why? If I assume visually, of course, I know why. If I assume visually, right. So, you didn't know this? Nope. Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. No way. So, if you assume? Yep. Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know why. So, you assume? Yep. Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. No way. So, if you assume? Yep. Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. No way. If I assume visually, I know. So, if you assume? Yep. Right, of course. You have no idea. No way. So, if you assume? Yep. Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. I know why. So if you assume, yep. Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. I know why. If I assume, definitely. Because I didn't know this. If I assume, visually. Did I realize that? Of course. You have no idea. I know why. So if you assume visually, yep, right. You have no idea. I know why. So if you assume, yep, right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know why. So, if you assume, yep, right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know why. So if you assume, yep, right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. If you assume, I know why. If I assume visually. Of course, you have no idea. So, if you assume, yep, right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course, right, yeah. Excuse me. You have no idea. Of course. For some reasons, well, if you assume, yep. Right. So, you didn't know this? Nope. Right. So, if you assume, visually, of course. I know why. So, if you assume, yep. Right. You have no idea. Of course. If I assume, visually, I know why. So, if you assume, yep. Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. You have no idea. I know. So if you assume, yep. Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually? Of course. I know. So if you assume, yep. Right, yeah. If I assume visually, of course. You have no idea. I know, why? So, if you consume, yep, right, yeah. Did I realize actually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, why? So, if you consume usually, yep, right, yeah. You have no idea. Eventually. Of course. So, if you consume, yep, right, yeah. Did I realize actually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, why? If I assume, Julie. Of course, you have no idea. I know, right? So, if you assume, yep, right. So, you didn't know this? Nope. If I assume, Julie. Of course, you have no idea. I know, right? So, if I assume, yep, right, yeah. Did I realize that? Of course. You have no idea. If I assume, Julie, I know, right? So if you assume, yep. Right. Did I realize that, Julie? Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So if you assume, Julie, of course. If I assume, Julie, I know, why. If I assume, definitely. By the way, if I assume, Julie. Of course. If I assume, eventually, you have no idea. So, did I realize that? Yep. Right. So, if you assume, yep. Of course. You have no idea. I know, why? So, if you assume, yep. Of course. You have no idea. I know. For some reasons, right? Well, if you assume, Italy, of course. Because you didn't know this. I know, why?